Alrighty, everybody, welcome. Thank you for joining me on this extraordinarily luxurious evening where we'll be just talking about very minor, frivolous issues, maybe some entertainment news, maybe some gossip about the British royal family or something. And, we'll just have a little bit of a laugh together. Well, no, of course, that's not the reason for this stream. The reason for this stream is that the dialogue, to put it charitably, around the Afghanistan withdrawal in the subsequent events since the Taliban took control of the country and the Afghan government collapsed, it's been some of the most outlandishly propagandistic media coverage I can personally recall in quite some time, in terms of, let's say, the tone, the framing, the experts who are sought after for their supposed words of sagely wisdom. It's just been really quite mind-blowing. So that's the topic of this stream. I want to just let you all know that the first half or so of the stream will be here on YouTube for all to peruse. And then the second half will be on Rockfin, which is the streaming service and media platform that I've joined and which has a whole lot of great stuff on it increasingly. Max Blumenthal is on there and others from the Gray Zone as of, I think, last week. And I've been on since June. And it's a great platform, a great concept behind it. It has independence kind of embedded within its founding philosophy because it runs on a cryptocurrency system that I'll admit is kind of above my pay grade to explain adequately. But it still is quite impressive an operation, and I think is the way of the future, particularly as YouTube seemingly cracks down on freedom of expression in a whole variety of ways and is more and more bureaucratized and subject to the kind of moralizing whims of the loudest shriekers in the room. So the link to Rockfin is in the description box here on YouTube, and you can watch the second half of this stream. All right, so why do I say that the coverage of the Afghanistan withdrawal has been stunningly, I would even contend, mind-bogglingly horrible? Well, I got to take a step back. Supermajorities of the American public have affirmed for years upon years that they support the withdrawal of U.S. forces from Afghanistan. 3 presidents have at least expressed their claimed desire to withdraw troops from Afghanistan. Presidents of both parties, Barack Obama, Donald Trump, now Joe Biden. The concept of war weariness or being fed up with endless wars has entered the political mainstream. Both parties at least gesture toward the idea that the American taxpayer has overcommitted itself overseas. The American military has overextended itself in war zones in far-flung places for way too long, squandering way too much resources, losing way too many lives, and so on. And even many of the most ardent hawks in both parties tend to acknowledge or faint towards this notion of ending endless wars, at least being desirable. Right? So Joe Biden, whatever you may think of him, whatever else You may criticize him for whatever other view you might have about Joe Biden as a person, as a political figure, as a president. He made the decision in April, publicly announced, not hidden, that the United States would be completing its pre-existing commitment to withdraw from Afghanistan by September 11th of this year. Now, was that a symbolic date that he cited as to when the United States needed to withdraw by? Sure, but any date was going to be ultimately arbitrary. It's not as though there was ever going to be some beautifully opportune date on which to finally withdraw from Afghanistan. A date had to just be picked, and so that was picked. And this was in the works for months. Donald Trump, to his credit, authorized direct negotiations with the Taliban in 2020 with the aim of ending the war in Afghanistan. And as I've mentioned before on different venues, Trump did something there diplomatically that was a genuine breakthrough. I mean, if you're old enough, as I am, try to think back to the most heady days of the George W. Bush presidency, where it was just a truism that, of course, the United States would never negotiate with terrorists. We will not negotiate with terrorists. And that was purported to include the Taliban. So just that the United States president would be involved in negotiation with the Taliban was almost unthinkable not very long ago. And remember, Trump even wanted to invite the Taliban leadership to Camp David on the anniversary of September 11th in 2019. And that was scuttled in part by the machinations of John Bolton, who then was fired, and there was a whole imbroglio over that. So this has been in the works for a long time. And it's been both parties, presidents of both parties, who have facilitated in one way or another the withdrawal, the long overdue withdrawal, the publicly supported withdrawal of U.S. forces from Afghanistan. And when I say publicly supported, it's a super majoritarian position. Now, some polls ask the question differently, but supermajorities of the American public have long said, meaning 67+%, usually upwards of 70 or 75% of Americans say yes to the question posed, do you want to withdraw troops from Afghanistan? And it spans the partisan spectrum, right? So that's the context. And why is it that the United States was finally setting out its intention to execute a full withdrawal from Afghanistan? Well, because the policy was a failure. The policy was intrinsically failed. It was intrinsically doomed. And even if the presidents or the other politicians, military leaders, etc., even if they didn't characterize it in such blunt terms, there was a clear recognition that the nation-building policy and the counterinsurgency policy and the state constructing policy that the U.S. had embarked on ever since the remnants of al-Qaeda were flushed out of Afghanistan in 2001 or 2, there's been widespread acknowledgement and acceptance that the policy had failed. And the policy had been pursued from a wide range of different tactical standpoints. Obama oversaw the greatest escalation in Afghanistan of the entire war in terms of surging in U.S. military personnel. It's just amazing when you reflect back on it, and it should have been regarded as more amazing at the time, meaning amazing in a perverse, pessimistic way, that the years in which the United States sustained the most casualties of U.S. military personnel were about a decade after 9/11. So a decade after the initial impetus for this intervention. In just the years 2010 to 2011, you had over 800 U.S. soldiers killed in Afghanistan. And I really wonder, and this would apply to 2010 just as it would today, I really wonder if you just approached the average American citizen on the street, could they give you an explanation, either a decade ago or today, why it is that so many years after 9/11, we were seeing that the United States was devoting those sorts of that sort of manpower to Afghanistan and incurring that level of casualties? I don't think you'd get I think you would get blank stares. I think you would get a quizzical look. I think you would get flustered kind of confusion as to why that was the policy, because it doesn't make any sense. It didn't make any sense then. It doesn't make any sense now, because the entire intervention was predicated on fallacies, which is that the United States has the capacity to build in its own image a government in Afghanistan that would be viable in the long term. And that was demonstrated with finality this past week when the Afghan government just disintegrated in a matter of days. So when people talk about how the execution of this withdrawal was so horrible, when you have experts and pundits on TV fuming that it's an abomination for a withdrawal to have been conducted in this manner, the follow-up question that should be asked, but seemingly never is wasn't the true policy failure the U.S. mission in Afghanistan in the first place? Like, the collapse of the Afghan government proves that the fundamental policy ambition was wildly, fatally flawed. And that's why I liken this obsession with the logistical details around the withdrawal to getting extremely worked up and angry and vindictive and kind of self-promotional and self-congratulatory and just reacting disproportionately to if you're in a near fatal car crash, right? And you're rescued. You are rescued within an inch of your life from the car crash. But as you're extracted from the wreckage, it turns out that you get a scratch on your arm from the debris. And you are led away from the site of this hellacious crash. And then you start fixating on the scratch that you sustained on your arm. That seems to me like an apt analogy here, because if anybody wants to direct complaints about execution of policy as regards Afghanistan, they should really be turning their attention to 20 years of failed policy, which created the condition, meaning the failure and collapse of the Afghan government, such that a withdrawal had to be executed in this unwieldy fashion. The United States spent billions upon billions of dollars arming, funding, propping up, constructing, advising the Afghan government over 20 years. And that policy was the central failure. I mean, you hear a lot of Republicans now who, notwithstanding Trump's, I think, laudable engagement with the Taliban to try to come to a resolution of the conflict and withdraw troops, you have a lot of Republicans now saying, oh, well, the difference with Trump's planned withdrawal would have been that it was conditions-based, meaning a condition could have just been invented and cited as a reason to delay in perpetuity U.S. withdrawal, even though that's widely supported across the political spectrum. But really, isn't the basic truth the elemental condition that the Afghan government was so weak, so almost non-existent, that it would collapse upon the most minimal strain and just give itself over to the encroaching Taliban? That's the real condition that people should be focused on and angry about. It's just very ironic that it's not the policy itself, apparently, that draws the most ire in the corporate media, in the political class, even in the, quote, international community. It's not the failure of the central policy. It's the termination of that policy which gets them worked into a lather. Why is it that we have all these cries for resignations, for shame to be felt, for some kind of reckoning? But those cries are being aimed at the officials who finally, belatedly, long overdue, terminated a failed policy. I mean, clearly the supermajorities of both parties wanted this done because there was at least some sense of recognition that the policy had not worked. And so that policy has been terminated. But once it's terminated, you have this outburst of rage and indignation. Look on any mainstream media outlet now, left, right, center, wherever, and you're bound to see coverage which either implicitly or explicitly condemns the decision to withdraw from Afghanistan. And I've been constantly hearing over these past few days that no, you're misstating this, or you're mischaracterizing why we're so upset. It's not that we're against withdrawing from Afghanistan. We want to withdraw from Afghanistan. What we're against is the execution, the botched execution of this withdrawal. Well, the entire mission was botched. In order to rectify a botched situation, you have to implement a botched kind of rescue scenario. Just like you botched your driving skills when you got into the near fatal car crash. That was the original sin, the policy itself. And to kind of nitpick and obsess on the logistical details of the withdrawal misses the forest for the trees in this to such an extent that it really is overwhelming propaganda. Now, I'm not saying that you can't criticize the precise details of how Biden and the administration chose to go about doing things. But, in theory, you could also criticize the guy who extricated you from the car crash, but probably your attention is being misdirected. the outrage and the just incredible histrionic naysaying about the withdrawal gets to a fundamental reality about American political media culture, which is that even though it's now a long accepted truism that the public is war weary and the public wants to end endless wars, when the decision comes down to actually and tangibly end an endless war, not just talk about it, not just create a slogan about it, not just run a electoral campaign on the basis of it, but to actually do it, you then run up against this enormous pushback such that Biden withdrawing troops from Afghanistan is now being portrayed as like the most scandalous moment of his entire presidency. So what kind of incentive is that? What kind of dynamic is that to impose upon elected officials, which is that if you actually try to execute what everybody at least says they want, then you're in for a real political bloodbath if it's at all unorderly. When we hear that word being trotted around constantly now, the withdrawal should have been orderly. The withdrawal should have been, I don't know, seamless, and the remaining American personnel should have been bidden farewell with like rose petals and champagne and gift baskets or something. No, the whole point of terminating the policy was that the policy was fatally flawed. And so, yeah, a withdrawal is probably going to be flawed likewise. But if you're so determined to dwell upon that, I question your appreciation of the scope of the policy failure here. I question your recognition of the circumstances which led to an admittedly imperfect withdrawal. I question the paradigm through which you are viewing this. And I also question whether you are generally committed to ending endless wars. I mean, do you think ending endless wars is always going to be pretty? Do you think it's always going to be, a beautifully tearful, symbolic farewell that everybody can just gather around and reminisce about and feel great about? No, the reason why the endless war had to be ended was because it was at its heart an exercise in profound corruption and graft and waste and wrong-headed strategy. So why are we blaming the guy who rescued you from the car crash? Why are we blaming the policymakers who finally got around to putting an end to the intervention that everybody seems to recognize was unsalvageable? It's really, it should occasion a lot of pessimism for the prospect of actually following through on the policy initiative of reining in America's overseas footprint, of removing U.S. personnel from war zones. Because the minute something goes wrong, the minute a viral video comes out that shows scenes of chaos, or the minute that, this or that humanitarian consequence can be fixated upon unrelentingly, then that's how the policy of withdrawing from endless wars gets portrayed. And it causes the public to reconsider whether withdrawing from these endless wars is really what they want. I mean, you look at the polling data now, fewer and fewer Americans than just a few months ago are saying that they support withdrawal from Afghanistan because of this propaganda offensive. And it is a propaganda offensive because why should there be such incredible uniformity of opinion on all these mainstream outlets? CNN, Fox, NBC, you name it, Washington Post, New York Times, where they're all in unison, chanting the same thing. Oh, this is a horrible blow to American credibility. It's a catastrophe. Blah 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 blah. Well, why isn't the intervention itself over 20 years of failure and misery and wreckage? Why isn't that a blow to American credibility? Why isn't that a catastrophe? Why isn't that follow-up question that I'm repeating now ad nauseum even posed? Because there is this mindset, this mentality that is deeply rooted in the media to truly advocate for endless war. Even if they don't come out overtly and say it all the time, a position in favor of endless war or U.S. interventionism or U.S. military engagement overseas is baked into the premises of so much of what they do, so many of the questions they ask. Even Biden, on an interview with George Stephanopoulos, that seems like it was concealed from the public in its full version. I mean, there's a text transcript of the supposedly the full interview on the ABC website, but it's so bizarrely garbled that it raises suspicions as to why the full video wasn't released, because Biden, his communication skills seem to be deteriorating, to put it nicely. But even if you look at the questions that Stephanopoulos asked Biden, they're all from an implicitly pro-war perspective. Like, there's no question from Stephanopoulos to Biden that holds him to account for why it took this long to withdraw from Afghanistan, for why the mission wasn't aborted sooner, for why the administration that Biden was previously a part of, from 2009 to 2017, escalated in Afghanistan and sent U.S. soldiers to their deaths for no discernible reason. There's no questions being posed from that vantage point. And you see that every time there's a Pentagon briefing and reporters are posing questions. You see that in almost all of the relevant punditry and commentary of all the experts trotted out. It's a propagandistic onslaught, and it's one of the worst episodes of it, in my view, in recent memory. And that's really saying a lot, given all that we went through in the 5 years of Trump at the helm, when you had Russiagate, you had the freakouts over Trump's planned withdrawals that never came to fruition from Syria, from Afghanistan, all the daily catastrophizing of whatever minor snafu that Trump got himself into. To say that this episode involving the Afghanistan withdrawal is in its own league is really underscoring how severe the propaganda is here, and has very little to do with what you personally think about Biden or whether you want to give him credit or any of these cheap pundit-like considerations. So that's my view. I articulated that view on a Substack post this week, which is linked to in the description box. I articulated also on the Crystal and Sagar show on YouTube earlier today. That's also linked in the description box. And if you don't agree, okay, well, let's hash it out, because I'm shocked. I mean, I shouldn't be, but I am shocked at just how cripplingly conformist so much of the mainline popular media is on this subject. And from there, I'm now going to transition to Rockfin for the remainder of the stream. So click on the link in the description box to get there and subscribe to my channel there. And going to execute that right now. see if I can figure out how to do it. Yikes. Mm-hmm. Okay, so I thought I knew how to execute this change, but I'm just going to leave it be for now. But you should sign up for go to the Rockfin link and sign up for the channel there and get all the other exclusive content at Rockfin, because there's a lot of good stuff on there, and that's going to be my primary video outlet. So I'll try to troubleshoot this for next time. But I haven't done a full live stream on YouTube in a while, so it's fine. So a few more points on Afghanistan, right? Interestingly, one of the most consistent critics of America's Afghanistan policy is actually an agency of the American government that gets very little attention and is mostly unknown to the public. And that is an Inspector General agency that was authorized legislatively in 2008 to oversee and scrutinize and audit the American reconstruction effort in Afghanistan. And conveniently, they put out a report. It's called, the acronym is SIGAR, SIGAR. And it's, an Inspector General agency for the Afghanistan war/reconstruction effort. And they put out just a bruising assessment this month, before the Afghan government collapsed, on the futility of American policy in Afghanistan. So I'm going to read to you the summation given by a U.S. government agency just this month about the policy. And then you tell me why it is that whenever if I were to switch on CNN or MSNBC or Fox or most of this chattering class, most of these organs of the chattering class, why isn't what I'm about to read to you now depicted and condemned as a catastrophe? Because it seems pretty catastrophic to me, and I'll read it to you. The report outlines a few conclusions, but the core conclusion is this. Quote, there are multiple reasons to develop these capabilities and prepare for reconstruction missions in conflict-affected countries. So just to clarify, this is kind of analyzing the full breadth of the lessons of Afghanistan and recommending to readers why those lessons should be absorbed. As to reconstruction missions, one, these reconstruction missions are very expensive. For example, all war-related costs for U.S. efforts in Afghanistan, Iraq, and Pakistan over the last 2 decades are estimated to be $6.4 trillion. 6.4 trillion. Number two, and this is a U.S. government agency, remember, they usually go poorly. A bit of dry humor there, I would submit. Number three, widespread recognition that they go poorly, meaning Afghanistan in particular, because this is the Afghanistan Inspector General's agency. Widespread recognition that they go poorly has not prevented U.S. officials from pursuing them. 4, rebuilding countries mired in conflict is actually a continuous U.S. government endeavor, reflected by efforts in the Balkans and Haiti, and smaller efforts currently underway in Mali, Burkina Faso, Somalia, Yemen, Ukraine, and elsewhere. 5, large construction campaigns usually start small, so it would not be hard for the U.S. government to slip down the slope again somewhere else and for the outcome to be similar to that of Afghanistan. So this is a U.S. government agency concluding that the Afghanistan reconstruction effort was a failure, and they were confirmed in that judgment shortly thereafter, given the collapse of the Afghan government in a matter of days, and suggesting that unless these lessons from the experience of the Afghanistan intervention are absorbed, it's very likely that they're going to happen again, maybe not on the same scale, but U.S. statecraft is going to be deployed to other parts of the world under the same faulty pretenses. And so that's almost a shockingly candid indictment of the very essence of U.S. foreign policy in that summation by a government entity. And so I want to know why that summation is not reflected anywhere in the popular media coverage of the Afghanistan withdrawal. Isn't the termination of the policy outlined there something that ought to be at least, if not celebrated, recognized as an incredibly long overdue remedy to a failed situation? But it's just not. And I'll give you one little bit of from this report, which, if you're interested, is available for anybody to Google, but very few journalists seem to be interested. One of the forces that collapsed in Afghanistan was the Afghan National Police, right, which is kind of like a paramilitary organization. And this report notes that the advisors sent by the Department of Defense to train these police force recruits in Afghanistan, quote, watched TV shows to learn about policing. They watched American TV shows to learn about how to do policing, and then taught the Afghan police recruits on the basis of the TV shows they watched. I mean, that's just mind-boggling. So is there any wonder that those security forces collapsed overnight when the minute the American government withdraws full support? That's the failed policy. I mean, that's almost a comically failed policy. And yet you have the entire calculus here just inverted in terms of how things are being portrayed. And, I interviewed last month, July 13th, I interviewed a U.S. military Afghanistan war veteran who was involved in these very train and equip missions that were supposed to have readied the Afghanistan security forces to withstand an offensive like what the Taliban mounted. And he told me that his impression as somebody who was collecting all the data to update Congress and other U.S. government entities on the status of how these training and equip missions are going, he told me that he came away with the unavoidable conclusion that the U.S. mission to train and equip these Afghan security forces, on which billions and billions of dollars were sent, untold quantities of weaponry was transferred. He said it was a giant money funneling operation to U.S. contractors, because you would have the benchmarks for training not met. You would have equipment that was supposed to be used to further that training and to equip these forces go missing, and nobody would follow up on it. And that was just a fact of life in Afghanistan vis-a-vis the U.S. commitment of resources there. But you know who benefited? You know who did not incur any damages from that? It was the contractors who were providing the armaments and providing the equipment and providing the vast amount of all kinds of supplies that were, the American public was told were going to be used to fortify the country's defense forces, but were just squandered. So a lot of American corporations made out like bandits in this. They tend to be in Northern Virginia and Washington, D.C., and like Montgomery County, Maryland. And it shouldn't surprise anybody that the rate of growth in those counties surrounding Washington, D.C. outpaces by 3 times or more the rate of growth economically elsewhere in the country, because you have just huge amounts of money flowing in to these areas on account of their investment financially in these doomed interventions. So they made away perfectly well. And guess what? A lot of those same corporations are now employing or having on their board of directors the very same experts who are on TV or being quoted in newspapers or being retweeted on Twitter. They're taking money from the very corporations that underwrote these failed interventions and made massive profits. So that's why there's a huge propagandistic component to all this. And very seldom, if ever, are the corporate affiliations of these retired generals even mentioned when they're hauled before TV cameras to give their supposed expertise. I'm talking about David Petraeus, H.R. McMaster, Jack Keane, etc. These are generals who were architects of a failed policy, but now they're getting on TV and defining the nature of this withdrawal in terms of public perception, even though if there's anyone who should be accepting blame for failure and a catastrophic failure, it's probably those generals, in addition to the civilian leadership, but they're never even pressed on the subject. It's never even a point of contention as to whether they bear any responsibility. And so here's a Reuters article from today that gets to why I would contend that the attribution of a catastrophic outcome here is being misdirected. About a month ago, the Reuters article says, Afghanistan's Ministry of Defense posted on social media photographs of 7 brand new helicopters arriving in Kabul, delivered by the United States. Oh, wow. Just a month ago, 7 brand new helicopters arrived in Kabul, furnished by U.S. taxpayers. I wonder what happened to those. Well, now they're in the hands of the Taliban. Okay, so you could say that the withdrawal is bad because those helicopters are now in the hands of the Taliban. But that kind of squandering was a recurring, unavoidable fact of the entire intervention. That's what this Inspector General has been screaming about for decades. That's what these Afghanistan veterans who I've talked to have been telling me personally. That's what anybody who read the Afghanistan papers in 2019 would have understood about public officials, government officials, military diplomats, etc., almost all agreeing in private that these resources were being just totally squandered, and then telling the public a different story. So that waste, embodied now most recently by these helicopters being seized by the Taliban, that was just a basic tenet of the entire intervention. So that's, I would say, the failure. That's the catastrophe. That's what needs to be reckoned with, not the termination of that failed policy. And the fact that nobody seems to be making a public argument along these lines really shows you the strength of propaganda, the myopia, the inability to recognize what it means to end a failed policy. And also the transmutation of this issue into a cheap partisan talking point. That to me is the most obnoxious. When you have Republicans saying that this is the greatest tar on the legacy of the American presidency since I don't know when. They come up with increasingly outlandish time frames there. And she's like, okay, so if withdrawing from Afghanistan is the worst thing that any president has ever done because of some bad PR, because we have some viral videos of an airport not being overseen with the utmost orderliness, why isn't the failed policy itself dating back 2 decades, why doesn't that constitute a blemish on American credibility? Why doesn't the fact that it was allowed to go on so long blemish American credibility? Never get a good explanation for that. By the way, credibility is sort of a fake concept anyway, that experts and politicians just created out of whole cloth to indicate or to signify that they have this special knowledge about foreign affairs, which is just totally fake. There's so much fakery around this issue, and there's so many people willing to spin a partisan talking point out of this issue, because for 20 years, the Afghanistan intervention has been the lifeblood of a huge section of the American political class, the professional operatives, the consultants, the military officials and ex-military officials who then use their expertise, supposedly, from Afghanistan to join boards and to get corporate opportunities. There's a lot invested in not portraying the policy itself as a failure. Whereas it's easy to just say, oh, Joe Biden is so horrible because the Kabul airport was a little bit chaotic for a day and a half. And by the way, I'm sorry, but there hasn't been any American killed so far as we know over the course of this evacuation. There hasn't been direct hostilities between the American military and the Taliban so far as we know over the course of this evacuation. So if that's your definition of this world-altering catastrophe, then maybe you need some bigger perspective. Maybe you should think about why, as this Inspector General report noted, $6.4 trillion have been poured into interventions that have caused way more loss of life than this evacuation ever will. That's the catastrophic element here. And I would just encourage everybody to kind of consider the perspective they're bringing to the table, and also recognize if you're being manipulated into taking a needlessly partisan interpretation rather than understanding this for what it is, which is a huge bipartisan indictment on the very nature of the American political system that allowed for a failure like this to go on for so long. So that's my take, and I would encourage you to read the Substack piece. Look at my other appearances on the subject if you'd like, and we'll do this again soon. So thanks for tuning in, everybody, and take care.